So I'm going to start off by introducing Ben. So Ben Hasker, he joined VAGO 18 months ago as the Director of Performance Audit in the infrastructure and transport sector. Prior to that, Ben worked in senior finance, risk audit, and governance roles in DELP and its predecessor departments. Prior to joining government, Ben worked as a research analyst in the stockbroking industry and a freelance financial journalist, which I find is really interesting. I really like Ben, but I also hate it that he's got a 4 handicap and I don't in golf. There we go. I had to get that in. He's working on a number of audits right now. One is answering questions whether the $11 billion Metro Tunnel project planning process and early works have been adequately prepared for commencement for the main works. Also whether the market-led proposals, including the Westgate Tunnel, are assessed in accordance with government requirements. And he's looking also, just finished looking at the reliability of agencies' attestations of compliance with the Asset Management Accountability Framework. So Ben's going to tell us a little bit about what VAGO sees as its role, vision and purpose, how we go about identifying what to deliver, how we deliver it, and how we judge whether we've been successful. So please join me in welcoming Ben.
Thanks, Bill. And I think one thing I'd like to say is it's nice to be able to do this speech today because I have only been at VAGO for 18 months and I did have a lot of time at DELP and its predecessor departments before that. So I always had my own views about VAGO and how good or bad it was. And it's interesting to sit on the other side of the fence. And hopefully what I can show you today, and part of the reason I'm going to take you a little bit about what our plan is about for the next 3 years, it's been good to get an insight about how VAGO goes about its work. And some of the things I'm going to talk to you about today are insights that I personally have taken about how VAGO does about its work that hopefully that you might take on board for your own work as chairs of audit committees. So, VAGO and audit committees, Andrew touched on this a little bit earlier, just about our various roles. VAGO, and we've got a strategic plan, which I think is a good one, which I'll flash up in a minute, that talks about what our role is, and that is it on screen there. Similarly, I've begged and borrowed a couple of words out of the Financial Management Act, and I'm sure you're all across this, across all the detail about your particular roles, but those roles there are about independently reviewing assessing effectiveness, overseeing things, monitoring things, considering things. That, as per the FMA at least, is part of your role. I think Bill also in his introduction told you that one of the audits I've just completed is the Asset Management Accountability Framework, or compliance with it. And no doubt some of you are particularly interested in what that means for you because we did touch on the roles of audit committees in that audit. I won't say anything more about that audit now, but I'll touch on it right at the end. In terms of similarities of our roles, Andrew touched on this also, we are very similar. At the end of the day, we're both about providing assurance to whoever our stakeholders are. For me, the question is about assurance about what and for whom, and how do we go about deciding the what? I have an anecdote. Is when I was back in department land, a new secretary, this is a little while ago now, came to the department. It was his first day on the job, first time as a secretary. He assembled a lot of staff together and then he asked for questions. And the questions, one person asked, well, welcome to the department. It's your first day. What do you want your legacy to be when you've left? So he had to really think about it because I don't think he had thought about it coming into it. But he did, and he said that when he came into the department, his view was that public servants needed to be better at explaining the purpose and plans for what they did. When he moved on and left the department several years later, and he moved on to a secretary role at a larger department, he was again asked by a staff member, different staff member, what were the lessons that you've learned as a first-time secretary and what was your legacy? He explained that he thought that the articulating of purposes and plans of the organisation at the policy, program and project levels had improved, but what he'd learnt was that an equal and if not greater focus was and should have been on the execution of those plans. He invested a lot of time in making sure that the narrative within the department was coherent and coordinated and that anybody could tell a story about what they did and how it connected within the organisation. That's what he wanted to do coming in. Coming out, he sort of realised that the focus going into the next job was execution is just as important as planning. And I suppose that's where we're all here collectively in the assurance game. We're here to help. Execution, implementation, delivery of services, in my view, is where the magic largely does or does not happen. The responsibility for that execution sits ultimately with the individuals that steer those plans, which is often chairs of organisations, secretaries of organisations, in our case Andrew, but the support they receive from the staff to deliver on those plans is also vital, and the assurance about that support comes from people like us. So, now I'm going to talk to you a little bit about our plan and its purpose. This is a bit of background detail. I find it interesting because I didn't know much about this 18 months ago, so I'm going to hopefully give you a little bit of an insight about how we go about things at VAGO. Similar to Audit Committee's oversight of their internal audit plans, we have an annual plan. Its purpose is to show the Parliament, public and local government sectors our work program for the coming 3 years. In developing it, we engage staff in driving our program and communicating it to them. And in fact, while like CEOs and secretaries of government agencies, Andrew is ultimately responsible for our plan, much of the content is actually driven at the staff level. And we use it to meet our legislative requirements and our strategic objectives. Now, a little bit on our legislative requirements. We communicate what we want to do to PAYAC. Most of you will know PAYAC. They're pretty much, if you want to watch it, you can see a fair bit of PAYAC in action at the moment because they were in the middle of the accounts and estimates hearings post-budget. In terms of our formal requirement, we're required to complete an annual plan for the year, considering any comments that we get from PAYAC. The plan that we deliver must note any changes that the PAYAC makes that we have chosen not to adopt. It must include any performance audits which call for information from an associated entity. So I'm responsible for the Metro Tunnel audit that just got tabled today that Andrew touched on 10 minutes before it tabled. I'm glad he did that, I couldn't do that. So it must include, talking about associated entities. So for us, one of the associated entities that we looked at as part of the Metro Tunnel was the Yarra Trams, under the auspices of Public Transport Victoria. What we go about in VAGO is that we go beyond the requirement of our legislative requirement, which is all about producing an annual plan or a one-year plan, and we produce a 3-year plan. Now, our annual plan helps us meet our strategic objectives. This is our plan on a page at VAGO. It's on our website, everyone can see it. Our strategic plan for 2017 to 2021. In there, you can see that there are 4 objectives across the top there, increasing our relevance on the left through to leading by example on the right. The one on the left, increasing our relevance, is something that hopefully resonates with you as chairs of audit committees. We're always trying to do that at VAGO. And for us, success in doing that is partly, not wholly, but partly about making sure our audit program is balanced, and the effort is balanced across the things that we've talked about earlier, the efficiency, effectiveness, economy and compliance. We know we're doing a good job, and this is down the bottom here, you can see what success looks like. When more audits that we do, and I'm talking about performance audits here, originate from stakeholder requests, and that our reports and associated data sets are used more by government and by Parliament. Assessing our relevance, when we come back and say, have we done a good job, for us and for me anyway, comes largely down to the impact that we're making through the audits that we deliver. And measuring and thinking about our impact is important, and I'm sure you have the same thoughts in your roles. For us, impact is not just about getting a media headline, it's about using our mandate, our experience, our independence, and the relationships that we have with you and your organisations to craft meaningful reports that cut through. It's about writing and testing recommendations that can be adopted by agencies in a reasonable time period. For me, a good recommendation is something that an organisation can act on and do something meaningful about inside 18 months. If it's shorter than that, it's probably too quick and easy. It's probably a bit more of a tick and flick. If it's longer than that, it's probably too difficult. So for me, there's a bit of a halfway point about where's a good recommendation sit in terms of deliverability. I mentioned a little bit about the involvement and influence our staff have on the development of our annual plan. Bill touched on this before. So I'm one of the directors in the performance audit team for infrastructure and transport, but we've got most, not all, of the performance audit and financial directors in this room today. Some of you may not know them, so I thought I would single them out, which they'll love now. So I just would like them just to stand up and give a wave, nothing more, when I call their name. As I said, I know that some of them aren't here today, so some of them won't stand up, but transport and infrastructure, my counterpart on the financial audit side is Simone Bowen. I know Simone's here. Do you want to stand up, Simone? Just so you're aware. Transport and infrastructure financial director. Thank you, Simone. On the environment portfolio side, we've got Dallas Mishkunig. Don't know if Dallas is here. No, Dallas is not. And Paul Martin on financial audit. There you go. Thanks, Paul. Health and Human Services, we've got Kylie Dakin for performance audit. Don't think Kylie's here. And Travis Derricott. I think I've seen Travis around. Travis, where are you? Financial. Thanks, Travis. So that's on Health and Human Services. On the Justice and Community Safety side, we've got Caitlin Macon from Performance Audit, who I know is away, and Ron Mack. I think Ron is here. G'day, Ron. Thank you. On Local Government Performance Audit side, we've got Shiraz Siddiqui, and he's not here, but we've got Jonathan Kivalides, who is here from Financial Audit. Thank you, Jonathan. And I'm nearly there. On the central agencies, DPC, DTF side, on Performance Audit, we've got Trang Ho. Trang is here. Hi, Trang. And Tim Maxfield on the Financial Audit side. Thanks, Tim. And lastly, but certainly not least, on the education portfolio, we've got Andrew Evans for Performance Audit, who is here today. G'day, Andrew. And Charlotte Jeffries for Financial Audit. Not here. That's all right. Just to give you a bit of face to some of the names who do a lot of the work that sits behind what we do. In terms of increasing our relevance, which was one of the objectives I showed you on a strategic plan, that is just a schematic. I'm not going to go into it, but it gives you a sense of the space that we play in. I think Dave mentioned earlier we've got 550 public sector agencies that we audit from a financial audit perspective. In terms of, we look at both the state side and the local government side of things, and there are just some numbers about the size of the various sectors and assets, revenues and liabilities that sit on both sides of that. So it's a big remit within which we operate. So back to getting a balance and trying to pick what we're going to audit, which is the thrust of what I want to talk about today. We do want to be able to explore our full mandate, and we want to strike a balance. And the things that we do think about in striking that balance, which no doubt are things that you also need to think about when you're developing your audit plans. We want to think about dimensions such as effectiveness, efficiency, economy. We want to have a balance of audits that look at our outcomes being achieved. We also want to look at audits that are focusing on the back office stuff, the good hygiene, the good housekeeping. We want to have audits where we think we can add our own unique insight into the way we do things. We've talked about some data sets and sharing those data sets and using the powers that we have within our Audit Act to be able to access information that others don't necessarily have the power, and to bring combined data sets together and provide unique insights into performance about that. The other thing we think about is we think about not just the immediate term, we like to think about the longer term. And sometimes we look at in-flight audits or audits that are early in the implementation. The Metro Tunnel one I talked to you about, which tabled today, that is the first of what will be a series of at least 3 Metro Tunnel audits. That's a project which has just finished the early works phase. It's not being launched into the public, so to speak, until 2025. There's been a lot of press coverage about it. You'll see tunnel boring machines. I think Daniel Andrews was on the news yesterday talking about those. So we want to be able to not just go in after the event, and as somebody told me when I first worked in this organisation, we don't just want to go in and bayonet the wounded. We want to go in and we want to add value as we go. So we want to put our early insights in, and Metro Tunnel is one example of that. The Asset Management Accountability Framework audit, similarly, it's in its first year. Last year, all audit committees and all public sector entities had to attest for the first time in the annual reports about how they're going with the Asset Management Accountability Framework. We knew that compliance with that framework in the early days was not something that we expected to see, but we wanted to go in early and hopefully provide some insights which were hopefully useful for everybody who's grappling with how to make this work for them. The other example I'll give you around having a longer term perspective is we also have a thematic look, and fraud and our series of fraud audits looking at fraud every year over the forward period is another example of taking a longer term perspective. This is just a slide just to give you a sense of who we consult with when we develop our plan. It's pretty comprehensive. It's not just government departments and agencies, not just PAYAC. We consult a range of academics and subject matter experts, consumer industry and professional groups too. I've talked about leveraging our access, and part of growing our influence is about leveraging our access to information. We do have some recent examples of the dashboards, and I know Dave flashed those up before. The Local Government Performance Reporting Framework, reports into TAFEs, universities, and Vic Roads and Road Maintenance, and the tables up the back here give you some live demonstrations of what some of those dashboards are like if you want to have a look at those, and I encourage you to do that after this. We do have an annual planning dashboard too, and for me that is one of the key tools we have about trying to achieve that balance of what to look at. That dashboard helps us consider topics around things such as risk, materiality, resource in terms of the cost and hours that we're going to put into any particular audit, the impact that it has on agencies, so we don't want to keep hitting the same agencies again and again because of the impact that we have in terms of information requests, and we don't want to detract from people's normal job to get on with whatever it is that they're doing. So we do think about striking a balance and not doing repeat audits on a regular basis on one particular agency. In terms of achieving impact, at a more personal level, I think it's worth adding that for VAGO, the impact we achieve also stems from not just what we audit, but the process and the decision making we go through to decide what's in scope, how we engage with agencies, what we say and how we say it. And these things for me go a long way to creating the value and impact we're striving for. Things I've learned over the last 18 months after spending much of my work history previously in department land is I learned very much that VAGO, we are taught early on, do not sit on the fence. We are taught to be specific in what we identify. We are taught to attribute what we see, not to some motherhood statement, but to attribute it to somebody or something, usually the entity. We are taught in the art of using plain English and active language. These are concepts that I had heard bits and pieces about, especially in department land, but some that I must have been the last 18 months I've really learned to appreciate and value. I would venture to say that, going one step further, that in broad terms, speaking in broad terms and using passive language in my previous roles prior to joining VAGO was more the norm rather than the exception. And that wasn't particularly helpful in the organisation. It was at the same time seeking to be more accountable and delivering role clarity for staff. There was a lot of use of passive language, and I think, and I would encourage that using active language and plain English, which is a skill, and in some cases it's an esoteric skill, I'd argue, is something that I would encourage you and your roles and with your internal auditors to continue to push. Our annual planning dashboard I touched on, it looks a bit like that. It's a dynamic thing and it's up the back, and it does give us a balance about all of those things that I talked to you before about. This is the slide Andrew had up earlier, which is the retrospective, if you like, about things that Andrew has seen, our audit office has seen in terms of what's coming out of audits that we've done and the themes of those. I just wanted to post that there as a reminder, nothing more, about what we are seeing. I think Andrew reflected that Somebody asked him earlier about what keeps him awake at night. And I've tried to group a lot of information into a couple of headings about when we think about our annual plan and what we are going to audit over the next 3 years at least. What are the sorts of themes that our audits might respond to? And they are those. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about those themes as we go now. So population growth. Dave has touched on a lot about the security side of things, integrity and security, disadvantage and wellbeing, and I don't need to read it, you can see it. So, population growth. Everybody knows this one. The impact of population growth in Victoria and particularly in Melbourne is significant. It obviously leads to competing demand for a range of services, housing, transport, health, etc. And as a result of that, the government is making unprecedented commitments and investments into a lot of those services. I can speak more about the transport side than perhaps some of the other sectors that my colleagues could talk about in more detail, but just to give you a sense on the transport infrastructure, and I know it's been front and centre and arguably it was a big part of the election campaign at the state level. Level crossings, Metro Tunnel, Westgate Tunnel, North East Link, Airport Link, the Suburban Rail Loop are all significant projects that immediately come to mind, which are largely responding to population growth. It has other impacts, population growth, and some of those other impacts go to how we maintain all of these new assets that we're buying to service ourselves. Maintaining assets or problems with maintaining assets and asset maintenance becomes a flow-on effect from buying a lot more assets. Historically, this office, VAGO, has made findings for schools, TAFEs, universities, coastal assets about how poorly they're managed. I think at V-Line recently, again in my sector, we found significant backlogs, $500 million of backlogs in maintenance and fleet replacement. And similarly, our state-controlled roadways, we did an audit back in 2017 that said that an increasing proportion of our state roadways are in very poor condition. This growth has flow-on effects to just about everywhere. Maintaining assets in local government is one. We've seen increased populations of unsentenced prisoners in corrections. We've seen an unprecedented growth in student numbers. We've got 90,000 students in Victorian governments entering Victorian government schools over the next 5 years. All of this is a backdrop to some of the audits that I'll talk to you about that we are planning to do. What about integrity and security? I'm not going to go through everything on slide there. That gives you a sense of what we see are the challenges and risks and the impact of those challenges and risks in the integrity and security space. An example of a recent report by the Local Government Inspectorate on the integrity side for a particular shire found that significant grant funding had been mismanaged. Those things, and fraud and corruption generally as an integrity agency, is something that we will always continue to look at. Dave's touched on a lot of the security risks, some of the questions which are perhaps more myth than truth, but we see security risks around sharing information across government, data sourcing and privacy, the introduction of ICT common platforms such as e-procurement and finance. And we also have that general theme that we touched on around physical security and personnel security. In the disadvantage and wellbeing space, we see themes and risks across all of those areas. There are reports about the links between educational outcomes and disadvantage. We know that Australian students from high socio-economic backgrounds have greater average levels of engagement than those from lower. We know on the homelessness front, there are reports from the ABS, the Bureau of Statistics, that there are 20,000 Victorians currently or more who are currently homeless, and at least 1,100 people who sleep rough in Victoria's streets every night. Family violence is a prominent issue and something that will get our focus going forward. Mental health, we've seen studies such as those from Beyond Blue in 2014 around creating a mentally healthy workplace, which suggests that return on investment analysis indicates that a mentally healthy workplace on average may deliver benefits worth more than double the original investment. On Aboriginal health, the gap between the health status of Aboriginals population and non-Aboriginal population is significant, and the government has reacted with several initiatives in that space as well. On access to services, disability access to services generally for public services such as transport is something that we think is also a risk going forward. Around the theme, and Andrew touched on this a little bit, around capability, capacity and efficiency, rate capping, slower stamp duty growth from sale of houses, and the efficiency measures mentioned in the most recent budget are some of the factors that are playing into the risks that we see. Project management, or poor project management and deficient project management, we see as contributing to wasted resources and suboptimal social, economic and environmental outcomes. We've touched on the capability and skill shortages amongst our workers and the recruitment difficulties in particular spaces, infrastructure being a chief one of them, especially as we have this enormous pipeline of infrastructure going forward. Complexity in the justice space. We know increasingly that the legal and managerial issues dealt with by judges are becoming more complex, and we do need to create a need to improve court capacity and efficiency. In climate change and environment, these are quite intuitive and obvious areas: water sources, energy and targets, greenhouse gas emissions, bushfire risks and threatened species are all areas that constantly need to be under the microscope and are key areas for our audit focus going forward. So what does our audit plan look like? Now, we haven't tabled it yet. I think we're planning to table it on the 19th of June. But we can show you because we are still in consultation phase technically. So I thought I'd give you a bit of an insight as to what we think our audit plan for the next 3 years will look like, and it'll be carved up into sectors. So those sector directors that I just spoke to you and introduced to you before are responsible for the following. So in 2019-20, they are some of the audits that we've got there. And if I was to highlight some of them, in some sectors, they sort of respond to those themes that I was talking to you before. Population growth, for example. So in the education space, the one at the bottom there, the management of the student resource package, that's going to look at how the schools are allocating funding through the student resource package consistently and transparently. In the environment and planning space, developer contributions, we're going to have a look at whether development and infrastructure contributions are providing the required infrastructure to new and growing communities as intended. In the disadvantaged space, in health and human services, you can see a couple of audits down there at the bottom, managing support and safety hubs in Victoria's homelessness response. On the safety hub side, the state's made a significant investment in the safety hubs with just under $500 million committed over 4 years from the 2017-18 year to establish 17 support and safety hubs statewide by 2021. We're going to have a look at that and see how they're operating, whether they've been effective in addressing some of the family violence issues in Victoria. On the environment and climate change space, reducing bushfire risks for those who are in that space, and I know a few of you in the room have been in that space. Post Black Saturday, there were a lot of work done. The Royal Commission was done about how Victoria manages its bushfires. Put in a lot of activity around doing that. Things have changed. We're going to go back and see how that's being done now. In the integrity and security space, top left-hand side there, personnel security, we're going to do an audit into employment screening in the Victorian Public Service, looking at whether there's a risk of recycling employees. On the capability, capacity, efficiency space, Andrew touched on the hollowing out of the public service. So down the bottom there on the left-hand side, the use of contractors and consultants. We want to see whether state government agencies are achieving value for money in their use of contractors and consultants and preventing de-skilling of the public sector staff. back in my space, transport and infrastructure there, towards the right-hand side, we're also going to have a look at freight outcomes, determine whether regional rail upgrades are improving rural freight outcomes in a timely and cost-efficient way. For those of you who are familiar, I met the audit chair of the VicTrack Audit Committee just before. There's been a little bit of noise about how successfully some of our recent initiatives to improve rail freight track have been up in the Murray Basin area. That's 2019-20. Going out another year, 2021, these are some of the audits. 5 minutes, 6, it's nearly done, Bill. And I won't touch on many of them. Population growth, again, there's quite a few audits in there, whether you look at the bus services and how efficient they are, student attendance in Victorian Government schools, Plan Melbourne, maintaining local roads, managing railways. We're going to have another look at Metro Tunnel. There's just a few examples there. And then our final year of the audit plan, again, just to give you a taste of what we're doing. I touched on Aboriginal health, so we're going to have a look at Aboriginal health and see whether DHSS is making progress improving health outcomes for Aboriginal Victorians. We're going to look at the effectiveness of the Navigator program, which is in the education space, which is all about the links between academic attainment and engagement at schools. And we're going to look at, in the capacity and efficiency space, back again in transport, we're going to look at some of the major infrastructure program delivery capability. And also we're going to look at measuring and reporting on VPS performance, which is in the central agencies and whole of government space. So that's our program. That's about what we're going to look at. I've told you a little bit about how we go about developing it. How do we know whether we've done it well? I touched on this before. And I think just asking ourselves those questions and making sure that we're checking in against those questions and those points up there gives us a good insight as to whether or not we're making a difference. I encourage you to take away a little bit about how we go about it and what we do, and the insights I personally have learned over the last 18 months about what VAGO does. Hopefully it's something that you can find useful in your roles as audit chairs. So to take Bill's cue, my closing thoughts about service performance and high performance. Striking a balance. I do think it's an art, but there's some pretty good tools out there. And you would have seen from Dave there's some pretty amazing tools, but some of those dashboards out there that I touched on before are really useful in trying to have an objective and defensible, balanced approach to what it is that you do an audit. In terms of adding value in those audits, for me, it's all in the how you do it, the engagement, the specificity, the accountability that we demand of others and exemplify hopefully in our work. And then back to that anecdote I had from my secretary interaction many years ago, improving performance is not just about the planning, it's very much about the execution and the follow-up, and that's where assurance comes in. I mentioned AMF, and I thought I couldn't help myself. You'd all be interested in AMF, I think. So I've got one slide from AMF thought you might be interested in, which I'll leave you with. We, as an audit office, know that you, as chairs of audit committees, have got a significant amount of material under your remit that you are responsible for and signing off on. And we said in the AMF audit that the Asset Management Accountability Framework under the Financial Management Act is one of 458 requirements that audit committees and organisations are responsible for attesting to whether or not they are compliant with it. And we wrote a lot about AMF, and that's one of 458. Admittedly, not all 458 apply to all entities. So the age-old phrase for us is, well, in considering the roles that you have, is, well, how on earth can you put the time and effort into acquitting your responsibilities and adding value to your organisation for what is, relatively speaking, just a small component of your overall pie? And what we tried to, and we looked at all of the government departments for this audit, we didn't look at any other smaller agencies. It came down to really what we expected to see was that audit committees had taken a risk-based approach, but not just in talking about what they needed to see to assure themselves about what the plans are in place for AMF, but we wanted to see that that approach was documented. And that doesn't mean that we're expecting to see chapter and verse about all of the assets that sit within a profile of an organisation, but we do expect to see a bit of acquittal about how you perform your role to satisfy yourselves about the veracity of the information that's provided to you. The author of that report's with us today, Catherine Sandico, and if you do have any particular interest in a little bit more detail about that report, at the end of this presentation, Catherine and I will be up the back if you want to know more. Other than that, I will leave you with that slide. Thanks, Bill.